An incredible story, right?
Mm-hmm.
From, post-war devastation
Mm-hmm.
to this global economic and cultural powerhouse.
Absolutely phenomenal transformation.
But now it seems like the country's facing a challenge that's, well, totally different. Something really fundamental impacting almost everything. Demographics, economy, society, culture, even the military.
And the absolute core of that, the real driver, is this fertility rate. It's just plummeted. I mean, historically low levels.
Right.
Think about it. Back in the 1950s, the average woman in South Korea had about 6 children.
6. 6? Wow.
Fast forward to 2023, that number has crashed. It's down to 0.72.
0.72.
Yeah, the lowest in the entire world. And it gets even starker if you look at Seoul, the capital.
Okay.
There it's hovering around 0.55.
Half a child per woman, basically.
Yeah!
It's hard to even picture.
It really is. Let's try this analogy. Imagine you have 100 South Koreans today.
Okay.
Their children's generation. Only 36 kids.
Right, okay, quite a drop.
Then, that generation of 36, they have just 13 children.
13.
And those 13, they have maybe 5. So in just 4 generations or so, your group of 100 shrinks down to 5 people.
That's speed. It's just, frankly, astonishing.
It is. And this isn't some far-off future theory. You can see it right now in South Korea's population pyramid. The shape is already, well, it's skewed massively.
That's so.
Well, for every single 1-year-old child in the country today, there are roughly 4 people in their 50s.
4 50-year-olds for every 1-year-old? That really paints a picture.
It does. It makes the demographic shift incredibly tangible, doesn't it?
Yeah. And you hear people say, but look, the population is still high.
Yeah.
The workforce is big. GDP is strong.
Right, but those are lagging indicators. That's the key thing to understand here. The demographic momentum, the impact of those low birth rates, it's this enormous freight train.
Okay.
It's been set in motion, it's gathering speed, and even though things might look okay on the surface right now, it is coming. It's going to hit.
So that's what we want to do in this deep dive then. Look ahead. Specifically, let's focus on, say, 2060. What does South Korea look like just a few decades down the line?
And we should be clear, these are projections. We're mainly looking at the UN's low fertility scenario.
Why the low one? Isn't that pessimistic?
Well, historically, even the UN's medium projections for South Korea have turned out to be too optimistic. They've underestimated how fast the rate would fall.
Oh, okay.
And given that the rate dropped another 8% just between 2022 and 2023, well, the low scenario, while it sounds quite stark, seems like the most realistic path to consider right now.
Right. So based on that, paint us that picture. South Korea, 2060. What does it feel like?
Okay, well, first off, the sheer number of people. The population is projected to be about 30% smaller than today.
30% smaller. That's about 16 million fewer people, isn't it?
Roughly, yes. 16 million fewer people in a pretty short time frame. But the bigger story, maybe, is the age structure. South Korea is on track to become the oldest country in recorded human history.
The oldest ever.
Yeah. Imagine this. 1 out of every 2 people over 65 years old.
Half the population.
Half the population. And on the flip side, less than 1 in 10 people will be under 25. Young children, say, under 5. Maybe only 1% of the total population. 1%.
Yeah. So you're imagining quieter streets,
Maybe.
emptier schools.
Exactly. A society where that youthful energy is just much, much less present. And yeah, potentially even abandoned areas, maybe even cities, as the population shrinks and ages.
Abandoned cities. That's quite an image. What about the economy? What does this demographic tsunami do to the economy?
The consequences look pretty severe. Let's start with elderly poverty. Right now, it's already high. About 40% of South Koreans over 65 live below the poverty line.
40% is already bad.
It is, but by 2060, that 40% might actually look, well, almost like a fond memory in comparison.
Oof, why?
Because the support system is facing immense strain. South Korea has a big national pension fund now, right? But projections show it'll likely stop growing sometime in the 2040s.
Okay.
And could be completely depleted, gone by the 2050s.
Depleted. So who supports the retirees then?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? The burden falls squarely on a much, much smaller working population.
That worker-to-retiree ratio must be critical then. What are the numbers looking like?
It's sobering. Even if you make a really optimistic assumption, like almost everyone over 15 is working in 2060.
Which is unlikely, but okay.
Right. Even then, you're projected to have less than one worker for every single senior citizen, less than one paying in for everyone drawing benefits.
That sounds completely unsustainable.
The financial pressure will be immense. It makes an economic downturn, maybe even a prolonged recession, seem almost unavoidable. The workforce itself is projected to shrink dramatically,
I'm smaller.
possibly less than half its current size. Maybe around 17 million workers compared to today.
Can technology and productivity gains make up for that? AI, automation.
Well, yes, individual productivity will almost certainly increase. Technology will help, no doubt. But can it realistically compensate for losing half your workforce?
Probably not entirely.
It seems highly unlikely. Some economic models are even suggesting South Korea's total GDP might peak sometime in the 2040s and then actually start declining.
A shrinking economy.
Potentially, yes. And it's not just about the raw numbers. Think about innovation, science, tech breakthroughs.
Yeah.
Historically, a lot of that energy comes from younger and middle-aged people, right?
Yeah.
New ideas, challenging norms. If that whole segment of the population shrinks so drastically,
It could dampen that innovative spark.
it certainly could. It's another potential drag on long-term economic vitality.
And the government. How are they supposed to manage all this?
They're caught in a bind, a classic squeeze. On one hand, a smaller workforce means less tax revenue coming in.
Right, less money.
But on the other hand, they have this huge growing responsibility to provide healthcare, pensions, social support for a population where half the people are seniors.
So dwindling resources meeting skyrocketing demands.
Exactly. That forces really hard choices. Potential cuts to essential services, healthcare, education, welfare programs. Maybe infrastructure starts to decay, especially outside the big cities, because maintaining it everywhere just becomes too expensive.
Which could then push more people into the remaining big cities, I suppose.
Precisely. It could accelerate that concentration effect.
Okay, so the economic picture is pretty challenging.
Yeah.
What about the societal side, the culture? What does South Korea feel like in 2060?
This is where it gets perhaps even more deeply concerning on a human level. We're already seeing trends today. Something like 20% of South Koreans live alone.
1 in 5.
Yep. And another 20% report having no close friends or family they can rely on.
That's already quite high.
It is. And by 2060, those numbers are expected to climb significantly higher. Projections suggest, for instance, that half of South Koreans age 70 will have no living siblings.
Wow.
And about 30% will have no children of their own. Think about that traditional family support structure.
Yeah.
It's eroding.
And the younger generation.
Also shrinking dramatically. The group typically age, say, 25 to 35. They might only make about 5% of the total population.
5%. That
Yeah.
sounds incredibly isolating.
It really does. You've got elderly people lacking family support and young adults with potentially very limited social networks, especially if they're not in a major city. A widespread loneliness epidemic seems like a very, very real danger.
And the culture.
Mm.
South Korea's global cultural impact now is huge K-pop, K-drama.
Right, that whole Hallyu wave.
Yeah.
But who's driving that? It's largely people in their 20s, 30s, 40s.
The demographic that's shrinking the most.
Exactly. That key 25-45 age group. Back in 2000, they were about 37% of the population. The projection for 2060, maybe 16%.
So the engine of that cultural dynamism is basically contracting massively.
It looks that way. And it's not just the pop culture. Think about traditional culture, unique customs, skills passed down through generations. Even now, many traditions struggle to find young people to carry them on. If the youth population shrinks so drastically, it's very likely that many of these unique cultural threads will just fade away. It changes the identity, the very, soul of the place.
And what's it like for the few young people actually growing up then? In a country dominated by seniors?
That's a profound question, isn't it? What does youth culture even mean in that context? What happens to universities and schools when there are so few kids? Daycares. What job prospects are there in an economy potentially shrinking or stagnating?
It might push them to leave the country entirely.
That's a real risk. If young people seek opportunities, connections, maybe a more vibrant social scene elsewhere, you could see increased emigration.
Making the problem even worse back home.
Exactly. It could accelerate the decline, especially in rural areas and smaller cities. You might see more ghost towns like we're already seeing in parts of Japan with millions of abandoned houses. Large swaths of the country could essentially become depopulated.
Kind of reverting to nature in a way.
In a sense, yes, due to a lack of people.
And we can't forget the neighbor to the north, the security situation. How does this demographic collapse affect South Korea's military?
Yes, the North Korea factor. It's a critical overlay to all of this. The peninsula is still technically at war, right? And that tense situation could easily persist into 2060.
So they need a strong military.
They do, but maintaining their current system of mandatory military service, young men serving for about 18 months, becomes incredibly difficult when your pool of young men shrinks so dramatically.
The numbers just don't add up.
Look at it this way. Just to keep the same proportion of combat-age men in the military as they have today, which is around 5%.
Okay.
By 2060, because the pool is so much smaller, they'd need something like 15% of all combat-age men to be serving at any given time.
15%.
Wow.
Is that even feasible, socially acceptable?
It's highly questionable. The strain on society, on the economy, on those young men, it would be enormous. It forces some very tough questions about future defense posture.
Okay, this entire picture you've painted is, well, it's deeply unsettling. Is there any chance this can be turned around? Is there any hope?
The honest answer is that the demographic momentum is just incredibly powerful at this stage. It's very, very hard to reverse quickly.
Meaning, even if things change dramatically now.
Exactly. Let's do a thought experiment. Imagine, magically, the fertility rate tripled overgate, right back up to the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman, and stayed there.
Which is a huge leap,
A
obviously.
massive leap. But even in that incredibly optimistic scenario, by 2060, the age structure would still be really challenging. People have described it as an inverted pyramid on top of a barrel,
Meaning,
meaning you'd still only have about 1.5 working age people for every senior over 65. So even with a miraculous turnaround in births today, South Korea still has to pass through this unavoidable demographic bottleneck over the next few decades. The math is just baked in at this point.
but you mentioned a kernel of hope earlier. What did you mean? Is long-term recovery impossible?
No, not impossible. Long-term recovery is theoretically possible, but it would require rapid, really fundamental changes across South Korean society. Changes that genuinely encourage and make it feasible for people to have more children again.
Are there any signs of that?
Well, there was a very slight uptick in births in 2024, about 3%, the first rise in 9 years.
Okay, that's something.
It is something, but it's tiny, and it needs to be the start of a massive, sustained trend, not just a blip. To get there, South Korea really needs to tackle the root causes of why the fertility rate collapsed in the first place.
Right. So what are those root causes? Why did this happen so dramatically there?
It's really a complex mix, deeply tied into South Korea's incredibly rapid economic development. That miracle on the Han River came with side effects, such as fostering a culture of intense workaholism, extreme competition.
Mhm.
Long hours are common, often unpaid overtime, even with legal limits. There's been talk of extending the legal work week.
Wow. So people are working incredibly hard.
Yes, but often wages, especially for younger people, haven't kept pace with the soaring cost of living, particularly housing in the big cities and the massive cost of education.
Education, how so?
Well, there's huge pressure to get into top universities, which often requires years of expensive private tutoring, the hagwons. It's a huge financial burden on families.
So extreme work pressure, high costs for basics like housing and education. It sounds like a system that makes having kids seem really difficult.
It certainly contributes, and on top of that, compared to many other wealthy countries, the South Korean government actually spends a relatively smaller percentage of its budget on direct family benefits and support.
Okay, so less government help too.
And then you layer on some, let's say, more traditional cultural norms,
Like what?
like the very strong link between marriage and having children. It's still quite uncommon to have children outside of marriage. Only about 4.7% of births in 2023 were to unmarried women.
Very low compared to many Western countries.
Extremely low. And within marriage, there's often still an unequal burden of housework and childcare falling on women, even those with demanding careers. South Korean men, on average, do less housework than men in many other developed nations.
A kind of second shift for women.
Exactly. While at the same time, men face intense societal pressure to be the primary breadwinner to climb the corporate ladder. It creates pressure on both sides.
So it really boils down to the society has created conditions where having children is just incredibly challenging or undesirable for many.
That's a fair summary. Whether it's conscious or subconscious, a large and growing number of South Koreans are effectively deciding that having children, or maybe even getting married, just doesn't fit into the life they see as possible or desirable given the circumstances. South Korea has, perhaps unintentionally, built a culture that leads to very few kids.
It's a stark conclusion, and the worrying thing is this isn't just a South Korean story, is it?
No, absolutely not. That's a crucial point. South Korea is maybe the most extreme example right now, but it's not an outlier in terms of the direction of travel.
Where else are we seeing this?
Well, look at China. Their fertility rate in 2023 was estimated around 1.0. Italy and Spain are around 1.2. Germany's at 1.4. Even places like the UK and the US are down around 1.6.
And 1.6 sounds much better than 0.72,
But
but
it's still significantly below the replacement rate of 2.1. A sustained rate of 1.6 means that over 4 generations, your population of newborns shrinks by 60%.
60% smaller.
Yeah. And a rate of 1.2, like Italy or Spain, that leads to an 87% decrease over the same period. And the really concerning part is that globally, these rates are generally still falling. There's no clear sign of a widespread recovery happening yet.
It feels like the scale of this isn't really sinking into public consciousness somehow.
I think you're right. Maybe because for so long, for decades really, the big global worry was overpopulation, right? Malthusian fears.
Yeah, the population bomb and all that.
Exactly. So maybe talking about a crisis of too few births feels counterintuitive, or maybe the future it implies just seems too insane to be true. It's unprecedented in human history, this kind of rapid, self-chosen decline.
And when it is discussed, it often seems to be framed just as an economic problem.
Right. It's framed as, oh, we won't have enough workers, or who will pay for pensions, which are valid concerns, obviously.
But it's much bigger than that.
So much bigger. It's potentially an existential threat to societies, to cultures, to national wealth, to our entire way of life. It goes way beyond just worker shortages.
So what's the bottom line here? What's the main takeaway from this deep dive?
I think the main thing is that we collectively need to start taking this incredibly seriously, with real urgency. The fundamental way our modern societies are set up, the values, the incentives, the very DNA of how we live needs to change if we want to create environments where young people actually feel able, supported, and frankly willing to have children again.
And if we don't?
If we don't.
Yeah.
Well, the rest of the century could be pretty grim for many parts of the world. That demographic freight train we talked about, it has massive momentum. It's not just going to stop on its own.
So the final thought, maybe for you, the listener, is
Yeah.
how deep do these changes need to go? We talk about economics, work culture, costs. But what else? What fundamental assumptions about life, family, success might need re-examining to really alter this trajectory? It's a huge question with no easy answers.
Definitely something to ponder.